Oops, too much darkness. Alrighty. Okay. Ooh, where's my tea? All right, so happy Friday, everybody. All right. So today, we should be able to get through the next big part of our discussion and finish off Smith, at least for the moment, talking about his kind of definition of religion and how religion ultimately works. In order to do that, right, we're going to finish going through the causal mechanisms that Smith thinks are the ways that religion's influence spreads over time. We covered a few of them last time. I'll review them quickly. And then if we have time, which I think we will, we're going to take a quick look at, or we're going to start looking at some of the sociological theories of religion. So we're going to go back in time to our friends Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, and then forward into some more contemporary and I think ultimately more useful theories of religion. Okay, any questions before I jump in here? No? Okay. All right. So the first causal mechanism, right, we talked about that. That was prescriptive teachings, right? Things that are actually taught by religions and therefore that people then do, right? So we talked about this last time. I won't go over it in depth again. Okay. So network ties, right? Things that get sort of passed through religious networks that aren't themselves religious, right? So voting Republican if you're an evangelical, though it's not taught by, Christianity. It's not an official Christian teaching that you should vote Republican or that you should homeschool your kids. It seems to be something that sort of spreads through the kind of religious networks, right? Or people who are connected in this kind of way. Okay. Contextual effects, right? Religion spreads. If an area is religious, right, you will tend to become more religious just by living there, right? You might not become like a, super observant Jew if you move to the deep south, but you probably will become slightly more observant than you were before. All right. And then I think this was the one we left off on, right? Obviously, religions often have social service programs, right? We're familiar with these. We know lots of, in Canada, it's principally historically been Christian ones, but there are certainly, Islamic and Sikh and Hindu kind of social service programs as well that we can talk about and that are important, but it's one of the ways that religion sort of spreads its influence. All right, how are we feeling about all those? Yay, for Friday, we're feeling pretty good. Okay, so this one is a little bit, I think, maybe harder. I don't know if it's harder to grasp. I think it's a little bit more abstract. But someone try to open that door and failed? I don't know. Oh, that's that one. Okay. I'm like, what happened? A noise. A door. Right. So social capital, right? So what is social capital? Basically, social capital is your ability to get people to help you in some way, right? This is the idea of social capital is always, right? It's not what you know, it's who you know, right? It's that network of people that you can activate when you need something that can ultimately kind of help you, right? So, if you're looking for that first job out of university and you happen to know, and you happen to be, an engineer or an accountant, and you happen to know someone at your church, mosque, synagogue, gurdwara, temple who owns a firm that does this kind of work, right? Well, theoretically, you could activate those people to help you get a job, right? It's like someone's uncle, right? So you activate your friend whose uncle owns a accounting firm, and he's like, yeah, I'll talk to my uncle. That's social capital, right? So basically what Smith is saying here is that, social capital, series of social relationships of trust and reciprocity, it's generated in a couple ways, right? Bonding within groups, right? So within your own kind of religious community, and bridging ties between groups that differ in significant ways. Right here, he's principally thinking about kind of bridging class divides within kind of religious groups, right? So you can, bond both with people, within your group, but also, bridge gaps that might seem otherwise unbridgeable between, say, age and things like class. So, social capital is really important. When we get to the National Study of Youth and Religion, we'll talk about youth and religion later on in the course. This is one of the factors that Smith cites as being particularly important in why religious youth seem to have, somewhat better outcomes than some of their non-religious or less religious peers in terms of kind of life outcomes. Social capital being an important one. We'll talk about the 10 mechanisms. Don't worry, it's a long list. I have them all just listed on a slide. It takes me about 30 minutes to go through one single slide. Everybody always loves that one. I'm kidding, everybody hates me. But basically, right, social capital is sort of intangible, but your network connections and your ability to kind of use other people, in a positive way, to better your life is something that actually leads, in general, to better life outcomes on the whole. So, okay, what does social capital do? Amongst other things, right, it fosters greater civic engagement, right? So people who are more interconnected are going to be more engaged in society, whether that's like helping out the poor or the food bank or picking up garbage in your community or actively voting, right? People who have higher levels of social capital tend to be involved in greater civic action. It tends to be good for communities, right? Communities that have high levels of social capital tend to branch out, do lots of interesting things, make things nicer, build playgrounds, clean up the neighborhood, provide things like daycare services and all of that fun stuff. For public health, right, people tend to be healthier who have strong kind of social connections, right? They tend to be happier. Mental health tends to be better. They tend to work better together, right? More social cooperation where you have high social capital, better democratic participation. Communities where, you have a lot of social capital being generated are safer, right? Because people care more about each other and therefore they're watching out for each other and more likely to spot problems when they're occurring. This is one of the big problems in a lot of cases with suburbs. When you don't know people, right? You have low levels of interconnection, so crime often goes kind of unnoticed or unaddressed. Educational achievement, people who have high levels of social capital will tend to do better educationally because there's more people to help them out. Okay, so social capital generated in lots of cases in religious communities. Why? Because you're in a mixed kind of environment, right? You are with a kind of broad group of people that have a lot of different interests. They're not age segregated, right? So being different than a lot of places that people hang out, people of different kind of age cohorts mix together, and therefore you get a lot of kind of interconnection, social capital, and people working together, whether it's, to help Johnny get that first job or to make sure that Mrs. Jenkins' lawn gets cut after her husband passes away, right? All of these things are social capital that are important, and it makes life for people in religious communities better. And it's one of the ways that religious communities project, right, into the community. Okay. So according to Robert Putnam. So Robert Putnam is this very famous kind of, sociologist, political scientist. He wrote, his most famous book is called Bowling Alone, right, which I'm sure you've probably heard of at this point. I think someone even referenced it in one of the questions. And one of the things that Putnam says in Bowling Alone is that roughly half of associational membership in America is generated in churches, right? So he suggests that about half the social capital that's generated in American society functionally is done in American churches, right? Even though, we've seen we haven't seen this. That's in another class we've seen this. Never mind. We will see this, right? Fewer and fewer people identify as religious and fewer people are attending religious services. We're still seeing, and that was true when Putnam wrote the book too, we're still seeing half of social capital, roughly speaking, he thinks, being generated just within churches, right? And they're one of, this is especially true as society deinstitutionalizes a little bit, especially millennials and Gen Z, very kind of institution-averse generations for lots of reasons. And as they deinstitutionalize, what we're finding is there's fewer and fewer sites where people are generating social capital in large kind of amounts, and churches remain one of them, right? Fewer people are going, but for the people who do go, that's a place where they generate a lot of social capital. Okay, how do we feel about social capital? We're good? Okay. Am I streaming right now? Yes. You scared me for a sec. Okay. Can I please quickly recap what Tom Holland said in his video? I should put on my accent, maybe. Did she just leave because I said I'm live streaming? No, I'm kidding. Your live's out good. I can watch this later. No, I'm kidding. I think she has a phone call. I should make fun of students, but I did. So what did Tom Holland say in his video? I mean, basically what he's saying is there's a sort of really long-lasting impact in Western society that is often in some ways quite difficult to appreciate of Christianity, right? Where especially as society really starts to think of itself in lots of ways as, secular, post-Christian, sort of... Someone's watching from home. Aren't you jealous? You also could be in your pajama pants and watching. Yeah, so basically that there's this kind of like Christianity, and especially, in that clip he's talking about the 7 authentic letters of Paul. I was going to list them, and then I realized I probably would guff it up, so I won't bother. I think I could list like 5, and then the other ones, it's a bit of a crapshoot. Anyway, the letters of Paul, right, are deeply influential in sort of Western culture, and that a lot of the philosophical roots of Western culture, things like its care for victims, is fundamentally as much a function of its Christian heritage as any kind of anything else, right? And even though people are kind of unaware, potentially, of how deeply Christianity has influenced the society, a lot of what made the West different, and a lot of what the West sort of exported to other places is very much deeply kind of Christian, even as the society sort of leaves behind its explicit Christianity. The roots of Western culture go very, very deep and are very, very Christian. Now, this is true, right? Like, not only of the West. He's just happening to talk about the West because the book he wrote is called Dominion, the Making of the Western Mind, basically cataloging all the ways that Christianity shaped the Western mind in major ways. Basically, every society is shaped by its religious system, right? Christianity just happens to have been shaped by... the West just happens to have been shaped by Christianity and a particular brand of Christianity, Latin Christianity. And it's the split of Protestantism also was important. Like some of the things that he says, right, that Christianity has this sort of emphasis on kind of renewal, constant renewal, the renewal of the person, rebirth. And, for Holland, he lays this out better in the book than in that clip. It sort of plays out in Christianity constantly sort of leading to revolutions, right? To always thinking that the world as it is somehow corrupt and needs to be reformed. So that, there's things like, there's all sorts of revolutions in Christian and kind of Western history that we sometimes don't appreciate. But things like, the Reformation, right? The Protestant Reformation that started in 1517. That sort of reshapes the West, right? Because it's like, the West and the church has become corrupt. We need to reform it, reformatio, right? And then there's been things like the Franciscans, a sort of revolution of the Franciscans. Like, again, the church was corrupt and needed to get back to its roots. Constant cycles of kind of revolution. Holland thinks things like then the Enlightenment, this again sort of feeling that we needed to reform society, came ultimately from a kind of Christian point of view. Even Marxism with its its focus on the world is corrupt because of the economic system, it needs to be reformed by revolution. He thinks all of that finds its roots in Christianity. And I think I talked last time about how you can argue potentially that, or is that a different class? Now I don't remember. I talk about this a lot apparently. That Marxism is a sort of Christian heresy, right? Even in its kind of notion of time. That might have actually been a different class. Was that SOS 100? I don't know. Okay, that was you. Okay. Thank you. I'm like, did I say that, or is that SOS 100? Apparently, I feel like I'm going very deep with SOS 100. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about it then. The fact that even the way we think of time in the West is fundamentally, for Holland, kind of a Christian vision of time, right? One which has a beginning and one which will then have a sort of end, right? The time moves in a sort of linear direction. This being different from, say, Confucianism or Buddhism or Hinduism, which tend to think of time as cyclical. Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering, especially with the letters of Paul, like Care for the Victims, is it kind of the idea that like we wouldn't have had these ideas without religion? Because you could argue human empathy kind of might lead someone to that, or is it like a chicken egg thing?
So, I mean, Holland being, principally someone who studied kind of antiquity, like the Roman Empire, what he sees in Rome and Greece is a particular lack of empathy for the victim, right? That they fundamentally didn't care about the victim. They didn't care about the weak, right? We'll talk about it a little bit too when we talk about the rise of Christianity, but things like malformed infants, right? Or sick infants. The Greeks and Romans would have just basically taken them outside the city and left them in the grass for animals to eat, right? And what Holland thinks happens, and I mean, there's other scholars that have said this. David Bentley Hart, who's a philosopher, has said this as well, and lots of others, that there's this kind of fundamental transmutation that happens when Christianity comes on the scene, because the God of Christianity weirdly, and I don't want to get into Christian theology because that's not the point. My point is more like religion affects societies deeply. But the God of Christianity is a crucified slave, right? He himself, for some reason in Christian theology, God himself is kind of a victim. And that for Holland and for David Bentley Hart, that elevates the victim to a higher status, right? Because if God's a victim, well, who does God identify with? He identifies with victims, right? And Holland will say in interviews like, this is part of the reason, George Floyd had such an impact, right? Watching someone basically on the ground saying, I can't breathe, that's a very visceral kind of connection to that worship, in a sense, or reverence of the victim, right? So that's kind of the point he's trying to make, in terms of Christianity, and it's connected to caring for the weak, that Christianity is very different in that way, especially from the systems that came before it, right? Like the Greeks and Romans didn't really care about victims. To be a victim was to be weak, and you should be a victim because I'm stronger than you in some sense. Yeah, please. Oh, who's Paul? Steve Bruce makes this point that I can't assume things like people know who Paul is. We'll read Steve Bruce later. So now we're getting into Christian history. So Paul was one of the most influential early Christians. Initially, he was, I think, a Pharisee. Anyway, don't worry about that. He was a Jewish official who was persecuting Christians. And then as he's on his way to Damascus, from Jerusalem to Damascus in Syria, basically to go persecute Christians, he has a vision of Jesus appearing to him, and he goes blind for 3 days, and then basically becomes a Christian and becomes one of the most influential early Christian thinkers, writes some 7 letters, basically goes around the Mediterranean basin kind of teaching and evangelizing, and then writes these 7 letters that are sort of foundational to early Christian theology. Yeah, please. No. He calls himself an apostle to the Gentiles, but he actually never met Jesus while Jesus was alive. So he was not someone who followed Jesus until he saw the, resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus, according to his own story, which he tells, I think, in Galatians, and then is retold in Acts of the Apostles. You had another question?
Empathy and all the principles that Tom Holland talks about is from Paul.
That's what he claims, right? Yeah, that's Holland's claim, that a lot of the reason that we care about, particularly the weak and victims, is fundamentally, he thinks, kind of laid out in the letters of Paul in a lot of ways, yeah. And they're the earliest, again, we're getting too deep into specifically Christian things here, which is fun, but yeah, I mean, the earliest Christian texts we have are the letters of Paul, right? They come before the Gospels chronologically. So, other questions? Are we good? Did I answer your question? Okay. Well, that wasn't a quick summary at all. Again, I highly recommend the book. I think it's really, really kind of interesting. Does Tom Holland also mention the slave labor and sex workers resulted from Greeks and Romans, but got overturned as Christianity was the center of society? Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. Okay. Sorry, I could get deep. I love Tom's book, and I love his work. Like his work on antiquity, like on the Greeks and Romans, is really interesting. He's a great storyteller. His book on the origins of Islam is really, really good. Again, and so you should all read Tom Holland, a great historian, and get a real sense of, especially how the ancient affects the modern. I think you couldn't do much better than Tom Holland. And unlike a lot of historians, he's not boring. So there's that, right? He's an entertaining writer, and he knows how to make. He also has what's his podcast? Okay, I'm gonna recommend to you a podcast as well. I think it's called The Rest is History, but I have to look it up now. And he's one of the hosts. I know I have it. The Rest is History is Tom Holland's podcast. So definitely and he has that charming, lispy kind of British accent that he has. So I know I sound like I have a man crush on him, and maybe I do a little. And that's okay. But yeah, I highly recommend his work because I think he's really an interesting fellow. And I believe he's not particularly a believer either, which I think is also kind of what makes his work interesting, is he's fairly objective in some ways. I think he's not coming at it from I need to prove that Christianity is true because I deeply care about it. It's more damn it, I was reading Roman history and I found something very alien in it. And, as I read Cicero and Caesar and all these people, it's I feel like I don't know this civilization. I feel like I come from something else. And that's kind of the emphasis of the book. But yeah, I mean, what does happen, obviously sex work and prostitution never fully disappears. I mean, in the Roman world, it was well kind of established that if you were a free Roman male, you could pretty much have sex with anyone you wanted, however you wanted to do it, right? Boy, girl, slave, anyway, I won't get into it, but the Roman word for ejaculation apparently is the same word as urination. So, it was just a bodily function that you could do, according to Holland. And he speaks Latin, and I don't, so I'll take his word for it. But yeah, I mean, so according to Holland, right, things like prostitution and slavery get delegitimized. Christianity basically in the West gets rid of slavery roughly until the 16th century, 15th century, at which point it comes back. There's a little bit of slavery in Europe, but it almost completely disappears because you can't enslave another Christian in kind of Catholic teaching. Once the Catholic Church gets weaker, that's when you get slavery kind of returning to Europe in major ways. But so yeah, and then Christianity, according to Holland, kind of overturns it again when the British in the 1830s, led by Quakers and self-styled evangelicals, decide, yeah, we can't actually do this. And the British go from one of the biggest exporters of slaves to hunting down slave ships off the coast of Africa. And here, that's William Wilberforce and that. Yeah, please.
Just wondering back to generating social capital.
Oh, good.
We're talking about the benefits. I'm just wondering through a more intersectional lens, are there certain demographics that benefit more, wealth, race, gender, especially with educational achievements? I'm sure inner city underfunded schools, you can be as religious as you want, maybe not gain as much traction as a fancy private school.
That's an interesting question. And to be honest, I would have to go digging into the numbers to know for sure. I'm just trying to think back because I can see the charts in my head. I'm just trying to read them.
You're in your mind palace.
I'm in my mind palace, yeah. There's a moldy old box, which are the charts from the National Study of Youth and Religion. Nice Sherlock reference, though. I like it. I remember with the National Study of Youth and Religion, controlled for racial outcomes, there's not a ton of difference. It's about the 8% of the most religious students, teenagers, had markedly better life outcomes. even when you controlled for like economic class and race. But I'd have to like actually go look at the books to remember, because I know they controlled for it, but as I see the charts in my head, they don't have categories for race on the chart. So I would have to go and check. I mean, you may have kind of effects of, poverty and less poverty there. But I still think, I think the research generally kind of shows still, that's an interesting question. That the social capital and all the benefits tend to mean that you have a better life outcome in general across a whole bunch of markers, even when you control for things like race and social class.
Would you say maybe the reason for that is religious institutions have more funding behind them? Like, you can go to Salvation Army, which is a religious institution, but like maybe if you aren't religious, maybe you don't feel as comfortable to like go to more religious-based things.
See, the only thing that I would say there is that, especially in the African American community, you've had these black churches, which are very prominent, which generate a lot of this social capital, but aren't like, super wealthy institutions, right? Just that they happen to be kind of community centers for people, right? And I think you find this with recent immigrant communities, right? Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus, right? Often the communities aren't super rich. They just generate a lot of community involvement and tutoring and things like this. Yeah. So that makes sense? Okay. Isn't Holland's argument religious essentialism? Maybe. I think the point is just that, we're affected more, and a lot of the values that we have are fundamentally sort of religious, whether we recognize them or not. And again, you're free to disagree with that for sure. There's almost no problem with disagreeing with Holland's thesis, and lots of people do. I think it's convincing. You might not. But yeah, because I think our values come from somewhere. Isn't that notion counterintuitive to what happened in residential schools when Catholic priests sexually abused Indigenous children? I think, yeah, maybe. I mean, that's not to say that the church has never been corrupt, right? And I don't think anyone who's intellectually honest, and certainly Holland, never makes the case that somehow, the church as it functions is somehow wonderful and makes people super perfect. It's just that the values kind of over time deeply get ingrained in the culture. And, a lot of the things that we think of as values probably come from Christianity. Now, whether you think those are great values or not, that's a different story. And certainly there's a whole Andrew Tate type push. It's more Nietzschean, but I'll use Andrew Tate because he's weird and I don't like him. A kind of like machismo kind of pushback now that I kind of see online. And it really, this goes back to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's ideas that Christianity had bad values and actually made society weak and bad, right? By elevating the slave and the poor and all that stuff. If you want, like I said, if you want a clear distillation by a stupid person, you can listen to Andrew Tate. Sorry, I shouldn't. Maybe someone likes Andrew Tate and I just insulted them. But I actually don't care. But yeah, I don't think the claim is ever that, somehow religions perfect people or that religions don't do bad things. Just that religion instills values deep into a society, and that a lot of the things that we think of as good, say about the West, probably have deeper Christian roots, right? A lot of things that we think of as, kind of the cores of an Islamic society or a Middle Eastern society come from Islam, and that, see, now I'm trying to defend Tom's book. That really wasn't the point of including the clip. It was more just like, deeply, religious values get deeply ingrained over time in societies. And the West is just one particular example. Okay. I'm not trying to defend any particular religion. I'm just channeling Tom. I should put on my British accent. No, that's terrible. Don't do that. Where were we? Okay, capital. All right. This took a lot longer than I thought it would. Let's see if we can get through the last of them today. Okay, so causal mechanism number 6, secularized religious institutions, or religious institutions secularized. Yeah, sometimes you have religious institutions that were built up in past generations, but lose their religious character, right? So now they are secular, but in the past they were religious, right? So yeah, religious causes built and established them. They were done, for religious reasons, but so we partly owe their influence, their existence and their influence to religious effects, right? It is a religious effect, even though today they are fundamentally quite secular. So the YMCA, right? The series of gyms, basically started as kind of gathering places for young Christian men. That's why it's called the Young Men's Christian Association. Harvard University, right, was basically founded, I believe, by the Congregationalists to provide a seminary where their clergy could be trained. Princeton was the Presbyterians. Cambridge and Oxford were both established, by the Catholic Church. And the Red Cross, right, the International Society of the Red Cross, again, began as an aid agency by Christians who, wanted to help people particularly affected by disaster and war. So the Red Cross, right, finds its origins. Yale, I think, I can't remember which denomination, maybe Satanists, I don't know. I don't like Yale that much. I don't know why. Harvard is much better for some reason that I can't explain. But yeah, that's it. Does that make sense? Okay, that one's pretty easy. The secular transposition of religious dispositions and practices, right? This is kind of Tom Holland's point again. Religious ideas and behaviors are transposed into non-religious contexts, right? Arguably, right, and the ideas of simple living that you find in the environmentalist movement, in some ways mirror, say, Christian monastic life, right? Living very, very simply. You could find it in, say, like the Trappists. You would find similar kind of, and the Franciscans, in similar emphases on ecology and living in balance with nature. Yeah, I mean, contemporary evangelical Protestants, this is a point that Smith makes in a book called Divided by Race, which he co-wrote with someone, and I forget the co-author and I feel bad. Michael something, I can't remember. But yeah, contemporary evangelicals reproduce the racial structures of American society because their model of religious interaction is interpersonal, so they're bad at solving racial inequalities, right? And basically, this has this kind of like idea of, we don't need systemic change. We don't need to change kind of systemic racism. What we need to do is just kind of be nicer to each other and, interpersonally kinder. That's the basic model of American evangelicalism. And Smith argues that it's that kind of focus on interpersonal, like not, these people are being oppressed by an unfair system. It's like, well, no, they're all individuals. We're all individuals. So let's all be nicer to each other as individuals and that'll fix things. And it gets reproduced in American society. That would be a bad effect. Yeah, please. What does that mean?
So you can use religion to get certain outcomes, but you can't get every possible outcome with religion. Like evangelical works interpersonally, which is a good tool
for some circumstances.
For systemic issues.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. That's a good metaphor now that I understand it. Yeah. Okay. Was there another? Okay. But yeah, no, I think that's a fair assessment, right? But basically, evangelicals will reproduce in society their own kind of way of seeing the world, right? It's like, oh, we fix things interpersonally, right? So we don't think about systemic issues because we're more focused on, everybody should, as an individual, should, have a relationship with Jesus and individually accept things. So there's not like a systemic society-wide focus, and that gets kind of represented. Yeah, abolitionist attitudes like those of William Wilberforce, the 19th century reformer, are mirrored in anti-racist movements like BLM, even down to some of the language. These are kind of subtle mechanisms. It's not as direct as some of the other ones. Like it's not as direct as, say, prescriptive teaching. It's like the ideas you carry around in your head because of your religious assumptions can be kind of transposed on society. So does that all make sense? I really want to get through all of these today. Okay, institutional legal codes. yeah, legal codes are often influenced by religious tradition, even after religions have lost some of their cultural power, right? So, yeah, Christian sexual morality or religious sexual morality in, I guess, Canada, the US, the kind of former Western sphere we might have called Christendom. The attitude around sex work, I think, is broadly still shaped by kind of Christian sexual morality. I don't think that's a particularly contentious statement, right? And so even after our society has become very much post-Christian, we still struggle with questions around, say, things like sex work because, we fundamentally have this Christian-inspired idea that it's all exploitation, something that, third-wave feminism has pushed very hard against. Yeah, a lot of Anglo-American kind of law is predicated on things like natural law, which comes from sorry, it's complicated to explain. It comes to us in its current form in a lot of cases from Aristotle via Thomas Aquinas, right? The 14th century Catholic philosopher. If you're Catholic, St. Thomas Aquinas. And it gets kind of distilled into statements like the one from the U.S. Declaration of Independence, right? So things like all men are created equal, right? That's a kind of natural law argument and they're endowed by their creator with, unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Now this is a kind of natural law argument that, nature reflects the God that made it, and the God that made it therefore gave people certain rights, right? And that this is kind of deeply embedded in Western kind of systems of thought, that you have inalienable rights. Well, where do they come from? At their core, they're kind of embedded in nature. Who embedded them? Well, I mean, that's, probably, at least for the people who wrote the U.S. Constitution, some kind of God, right? Although a lot of them were not Christians, but deists still. Okay. Yeah. One of the arguments that Tom Wright makes, or not Tom Wright, Tom Holland makes, he was sitting with Tom Wright, so he got me confused, is that this notion of human rights emerges from Christian roots, right? And is hard to sustain without at least a minimalist theology. And he'll, he points out in the book lots of kind of late modern pushbacks against human rights, reversals of things that we would have thought unthinkable decades ago, like, people like Peter Singer who argue that up till about 2 years old, you should be able to kill a child because they're no more sentient than a cow. Which, if it sounds weird to you, maybe you're secretly a Christian. I don't know. That's what Tom Holland would say anyway. All right, does that all make sense? Okay, good. Shoulder people, good? Okay. Because that's, all right. Okay, social capital, does it have to be somewhat exclusive? Any in the LGBT community? Is it considered less special if everyone's a part of it? I mean, I think fundamentally you have to have a group, right? It can't be everybody. It has to be within sort of communities, right? Because you can generate, it can be fairly big, right? You can generate social capital in a neighborhood, right? By getting to know your neighbors and building connections with them. But there does, I think, have to be a limit because it can't be, it'd be hard to generate social capital in Alberta because it's just too big and too disparate, right? So I think it generally is kind of generated in enclosed geographic spaces and particular communities. Okay, I really need to look up what being sealed in the LDS temple is. I've been leaving that one off for a while. Okay, we got two left. I can do this. I can't do this. I've only got 10 minutes. No, I can do this. All right, direct causal mechanism number 9, direct intervention by religious authorities, right? So basically, religious leaders can make direct interventions in society, right? So Gandhi's, nonviolent confrontations with the British, right? That's a kind of direct intervention. Martin Luther King Jr.'s, role in the civil rights movement as its leader, as its spokesperson, right? Using Christian language in things like the I Have a Dream speech to specifically speak to those deeper impulses in society. And John Paul II, right? The 2 popes ago, played a key role in bringing down communism in Poland and subsequently in Eastern Europe. All right, I have a short clip because I need some tea. Okay. This is Robert Barron again, so.
If someone had told me when I was a kid in the 1970s that the Soviet Union and its communist empire would collapse with barely a shot being fired, and that one of the principal instigators would be the Pope of Rome, I would never have believed it. Yet that's precisely what happened. John Paul II came to this square, Victory Square, in the heart of Warsaw, and he celebrated Mass in front of hundreds of thousands of people. During the homily, the Pope spoke of God, he spoke of freedom, he spoke of human rights. And as he delivered the homily, the crowd began to chant, "We want God, we want God." The Pope continued and the chant went on, "We want God, we want God." Then it was picked up rhythmically by everybody in the square, "We want God, we want God." Perceptive people at the time knew that the Soviet control over Poland, the communist empire, was effectively finished. This move of John Paul II is one of the most remarkable examples in our time of provocative nonviolence.
There's a really cool documentary called Catholicism. Anyway, interesting, right? He goes to Poland, he has this mass, and then, he appeals to the Polish people's Catholicism, and, it leads to eventually solidarity, the workers' movement gaining power in Poland in 1989, supported by the Catholic Church as well, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And lots of people kind of point to this moment as a definitive one for that. Okay, and our last one, deep culture and invisible religion. Yeah, and again, this is a little bit what Tom Holland is talking about too, right? We often have these deeply held, somewhat unacknowledged categories, assumptions, beliefs, and intuitions that drive events and our beliefs in ways that are hard to appreciate. This is kind of the point that Holland is making about George Floyd, right? It's like because he's a victim, and it's a society that through a 2,000-year history has been taught to revere victims in some way. George Floyd was held up and became an important kind of flashpoint in this question of racial justice. Often these things operate invisibly, right? People aren't aware of the categories and how they got there. It's just, deep culture, right? Religion has deeply kind of shaped a culture in ways that can be really difficult from the inside to appreciate it, right? And it's like, what's the joke? There are 2 young fish swimming in the ocean. They pass an older fish, and the older fish says, "How's the water?" They kind of swim on. One fish turns to the other one. He's like, "What's water?" Right? You're not even aware you're moving through it. It's just the kind of environment you're in. That's deep culture, right? So this idea of, the moral superiority of being a victim, arguably has its roots in, the crucifixion of Jesus, or at least in that Judeo-Christian notion that God identifies with the lowly, right? Arguably, right? Not necessarily true, but arguably that would be the kind of case that a lot of people make. We rarely stop to consider where our deepest ideas about society come from, right? Or how our civilizations were shaped, unless you're Tom Holland and you write 3 books about it. And then, people tend to. And history is progression, a process of degradation, repeating cycles. There's different kind of views of how history proceeds, right? In a lot of Asian cultures, we see time as cyclical, right? We go through cycles of time. In some other cultures, it's like, the past was the best period, and we're going through then kind of cycles of degradation until everything falls apart. In, Western cultures, those driven by the kind of Abrahamic religions, we have tended to see time as linear, right? Starting at a beginning point and moving towards some kind of end point at the end of history, right? this, in some ways, even though now we have kind of scientific proof for it, in a lot of ways, this base assumption was driven by religious assumptions at some point in the past. Okay, how do we feel about all that? Okay, those are the points that Smith is trying to make. I am done with this slideshow. I have 5 minutes left. Uh-oh. Oh, I know what happened. I broke my computer. Oh, do I want to start social theory in 4 minutes? Can I my first thing is Marx. I have way too much to say about Marx. Let's pick it up on Monday. I'd hope to get a couple of slides into here, but I can't talk about Marx's view of religion in 4 minutes and do it justice. So we'll pick it up on Monday. Have a great weekend. It'll be fun. There we go.